I'm Rollo Fari Hutchinson, author of How World War II Remade America. World War II was the most destructive war in human history. Over 65,000, no, 65 million. It's a staggering number. It's a staggering figure. Individuals that were the subject of murder, the subject of genocide, the subject of torture, the subject of mass bombing, the subject of attack. The most disturbing thing about this war, in addition to many of the other human tragic features, the most disturbing thing was the overwhelming majority of the 65 million, and there were probably more, but 65 million documented casualties, deaths, during the 6-year period of World War II, the overwhelming majority of them were non-combatants. A little bit of history first. World War II did not begin with the bombing December 7th, 1941. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, declared that the day that will live in infamy, and then declared war December 7th, 1941, actually December 8th, 1941. On the Empire of Japan. However, the war started in September of 1939. Nazi Germany, Hitler, the invasion of Poland, and even before that, in Asia, the Japanese invasion of China and the subjugation of much of China and Manchuria in 1937, 1938, and 1939. So we have to be clear. This was literally a 6-year war that did not begin with the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. From September 1939 to the surrender of Japan after the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. The war, essentially, the global war, more about that in a minute, extended for 6 long years, 65 million deaths, and needless to say, the number of tens of millions injured, displaced, families lost, and families dislocated, scattered, and many of them, of course, died. The concentration camps, Nazi Germany, and of course, the death marches by Japan and Japanese troops against American troops. The global dynamic that came out of World War II, namely big power rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. France, Great Britain, they were war-torn. They were devastated. They were bankrupt. The U.S., it became, after 1945, it became the Pax Americana globe. And we're seeing the effects of that today. Now, how did World War II remake America? And by the way, still remaking America. Let me give you a checklist of some of the things that came out. Inventions, technological inventions, technological innovations, technological discoveries, communication, arts, science, medicine, education, transportation, housing, and one of the major areas that I spend some time, in fact, much time talking about, the massive change in social/civil rights relations in this country. African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Filipino Americans, and especially women. Much more on that in a second. In how World War II not only, we don't put it in the past tense, remade America, but continues to remake America. Here's some factoids that many people simply don't know. Let's talk technology, communications, and innovations for a minute. When you talk about industry and manufacturing, the United States actually bankrolled, to an extent, the war machine in the Soviet Union, bankrolled to a large extent the war machine in Great Britain. And Great Britain was broke. facing the onslaught of Nazi Germany. For 1 year in 1940, the only nation that had not, in Europe, that had not been subjugated outside of the Soviet Union by Hitler and Nazi Germany. And the only reason the Soviet Union was not subjugated was simply because it had an alliance with Hitler and Nazi Germany for 2 years, to the detriment of Joseph Stalin and 27 million Soviets that died when Hitler turncoat, betrayed his erstwhile ally in the alliance, Joe Stalin. Factories, homes, offices, schools, communications, the automotive industry. Think about this for a second. When the U.S. retooled after it declared war on Japan, and then following that within 4 days, December 11th, after Hitler declared war on the United States unnecessarily, and essentially one of the major steps toward his ultimate downfall, one of the major mistakes of history, blunders of history on his part. Didn't have to declare war, but did. FDR declared war right after that, the next day, on Nazi Germany. So now we have a global conflict. Let me go back. Automotive, factories, communications, schools, offices, homes. What was transformed? The U.S. had to now gear up to manufacture the tanks, the guns, the airplanes, all the implements of waging for war, and also stepping up every kind of manufacturing good and service, and of course, agriculture and food items. The United States not only supplied military armaments, in the words of FDR, in his famed speech, the U.S. was now the arsenal, special emphasis on arsenal of democracy. But along with that, the U.S. also financed and also commodities, one of which, right at the top, food. Let's go back to the checklist of things in terms of remaking America that I mentioned before. Homes, offices, schools, factories, communications. Because of the industrial and manufacturing output of the U.S. Here's a checklist of some of the things, the innovations, communications, technology, that we now benefit from today and take for granted today. How about microfilm? How about the expansion of television? How about air conditioning? How about frozen foods, orange juice especially? How about microwave ovens? How about GPS systems? How about films? How about, in other words, the continuing development of the film and film industry? How about advanced computers? That's my favorite. Along with my second favorite, the internet. How about the jet age and jet propulsion? How about the Jeep? You know, when you see that SUV, where do you think that came from? It came out of the Jeep model. World War II, military use, conveying troops here and there, from point A to point B. How about the ABS system on automobiles? The anti-lock braking system? How about tail fins on cars? How about even the design of cars? How about transmissions? How about the expansion of the interstate highways throughout America? How about rail travel? How about the housing boom? Literally, manufactured housing, shopping malls, and that was all made, of course, possible by the expansion of the transportation system, namely highways. Suburbia now grew. Shopping malls grew out of that. Things that we know now, retail stores, big box stores grew out of that because now a transportation system that could move literally tens of millions of Americans. All of that was a military component that came out of World War II. Education. The GI Bill actually put literally tens of thousands of GIs in the colleges and universities, and of course, moving up the scale, the professional scale, the business scale, and of course, the income and wealth scale. Every profession, doctors, attorneys, computer engineers and engineer scientists came out of, in many cases, returning GIs that benefited from the GI Bill. In other words, paid for their education, paid a stipend, and encouraged them to go back to go to colleges and universities or trade schools. America's industrial manufacturing expansion and professional and business expansion and financial industry expansion came out of that. The essential development and foundation of a second industrial manufacturing and financial revolution in America. Again, we trace it directly back to World War II. They often say necessity is a mother of invention. In this case, never, and I can't repeat that enough, never a more significant, profound, and of course, needless to say, important maxim than all of the things, i.e. communications, technology, industry, that we can attribute and directly track back and trace back to World War II. And by the way, in the title, How World War II Remade America, it's now continuing to remake and redefine America. All right, let's talk a little bit about civil rights and the changing tapestry on the home front with social relations. Before World War II, women, by and large, all of that, there were some changes in the 1930s, but by and large, were still in the home. Mothers, caregivers, primarily, a house, domestic, i.e. internal. In other words, they were homemakers and they were housewives. In other words, a small percentage and very small percentage of women were outside the home working. And if they were teachers, nurses, pretty much ghetto-wise in the professions. It was rare. In fact, it was almost impossible to see a woman in a major plant as, say, a riveter, as, say, handling or working on an assembly line. You didn't see that because it didn't exist. World War II changed that. 12 million men were essentially at the peak in 1945, at the end of the war, were in the armed services. The Air Force, the Marines, the Army, the Navy, and many auxiliary forces. Women, by the way, were now coming into the armed forces. You had the WACs, you had the WAVES, you had the WAF, Women's Auxiliary in the Air Force, and of course, many other areas that women in military service filled, except combat. But let's go back to manufacturing and the industrial factor. Remember the famed portrait, Rosie the Riveter, with a headscarf around, jeans on, looking tough and looking very firm in the factory, holding a riveting gun. You had thousands of women that essentially now, because of a wartime necessity and a shortage of manpower, they're in the Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, fighting in Europe, fighting in the Pacific. They're not here. So it was a necessity. Women now became, within the shipping industry, manufacturing, within the automotive industry, tanks, jeeps, and all kinds of transporting armaments. And in addition to that, women also work in computers, the burgeoning beginning of the computer industry. Films have been made on that. How women essentially were filling roles now in communication and technological, certainly areas that before were strictly for men. And there were a number of women truck drivers, and there were a number of women airplane pilots, actually delivering planes from this country, transporting to certainly an embattled Britain that needed every ship and plane it could get, courtesy of the United States. Civil rights before the 40s, this was, well, even in the 40s, still a deeply legally segregated America. African Americans essentially doing the dirty work, essentially last hired, last hired, first fired, and the dirtiest of dirty jobs. No, very few in the major professions, almost none in corporations, anywhere, certainly not at the top and upper management levels. That was unheard of. So, A. Philip Randolph, a major civil rights leader, challenged FDR. In 1941, long before the famed 1963 March on Washington, A. Philip Randolph, who, by the way, was also one of the architects of the 1963 March on Washington and advised Dr. King, along with Bayard Rustin. In 1941, a famed meeting between A. Philip Randolph and Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the White House at the instigation of, in this case, the wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. So what happened was there was a challenge from Randolph and the civil rights leaders. We want a desegregated army. We don't want to be just mess men. We don't want to just be laborers. We don't just want to be pick-me-uppers doing the dirty work. We want to be a fighting force. We want to fight. We believe in America. We support America. We have bled in every war for America. FDR was resistant because he's getting flack from service personnel that said, don't do it. If you mix black and white together, it will be danger. But A. Philip Randolph said, if you don't do it, we'll march on Washington, we'll disrupt everything. FDR, after some thought, consultation, finally signed the Executive Order 8802, the Fair Employment Practices Commission set up. And now, for the first time, beginning in 1941, 1942, 43, 44, African Americans were now moving north, taking jobs within that were denied to them, barred to them before, in major industries, up and down literally the industrial and manufacturing industrial food chain. Hispanic Americans, the same. They were making inroads too in the same industries, although there was not a rigid color bar for Hispanic Americans to serve in, say, the Marines or the Air Force. At the same time, they essentially were still Jim Crow too. Asian Americans, we get to them. Asian Americans beyond Jim Crow, FDR, to one of his everlasting, in this case, shame and the disgrace of him, the administration in America. The internment of Japanese, the theft of their businesses, the theft of their farms, the theft of their professions, interning them in way out of the way desolate camps for 3 to 4 years. Despite that, Japanese Americans still loyally maintain their allegiance, despite the bitterness, despite the hardship, despite the incarceration, despite the injustice, to America. You had Japanese American units that served in the Italian theater in Europe that won more medals per capita proportionally than any other fighting units. The same with Hispanic Americans. They won individually the Distinguished Service Award, the Purple Heart, Congressional Medal of Honor. African Americans won many awards. And of course, when we come back to African Americans, who could forget the famed Tuskegee Airmen that flew not only reconnaissance flight, but also, and of course, did not want them in airplanes or even near them, except servicing them, if that, and cleaning them, if that, but were credited with a number of kills in combat, aerial combat, against German pilots, and also were given high accolades by a number of objective, fair-minded U.S. air officials who said they did a great service in terms of escorting us, the bombers, to bombing sites, and did a great service in terms of protecting our bombing missions. Hats off to the Tuskegee Airmen, the Hispanic Americans that won Congressional Medal Awards, Filipino Americans, Native Americans, remember the Code Talkers in the Pacific. They used, the Navajos used their language, and the Japanese didn't know what they were saying. A great service, won medals for that, as it well should have. And of course, women, although we're not in combat, women now at every step of the food chain, industry, manufacturing, armaments, technology, communications, and flying, aviation. Certainly women made huge inroads only and exclusively as a result of World War II. So when we track it back and we walk through the checklist of many of the innovations of World War II, they are staggering. All the way, anything from computers to television and all points in between, the internet, you name it, it's there. Aviation and automotive transportation, the development of suburbs, housing, certainly retail stores, education, and educated America. Now, moving up the scale at every step. High school, colleges, universities, businesses, the professions. America also changed the world. Now we get to the global dynamic. Coming out of World War II, America was the number one power, almost unchallenged, except now, a new threat as seen, the Soviet Union. So that changed, the global dynamic changed to America and Americans. Now you had the Cold War, 40 years of war, undeclared, a literally political rivalry, ideological rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States. What was at the center of that? Another of the major, perhaps the major innovation that came out of World War II, and that is still very much with us today. It ushered in the era of the nuclear age, the atomic bomb, and missiles too, by the way. More on that in a second. The atomic bomb, too, dropped on Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Great debate among historians. Was that really necessary? Was that really necessary? That will be a debate that will continue perhaps till the end of time. What there is no debate about is it changed the whole dynamic, i.e., nuclear, the nuclear age, nuclear energy, nuclear power, and most foreboding and forbidding the capacity and the possibility of nuclear destruction. The United States now had an arsenal, a nuclear arsenal, coming out of World War II. The Soviet Union scrambled fast, and within 4 years, by 1949, it had developed its atomic bomb. Now, we had an arms race, at least the beginning of that, a nuclear arms race. U.S., the Soviet Union. A couple of years later, the United States developed a hydrogen bomb. 3 years later, the Soviet Union developed a hydrogen bomb. So now, and following on closely on the heels of that, intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. Now the capability of, boom, shooting here, shooting there. Moscow could go, Washington could go, LA could go, Kiev could go, Leningrad, now St. Petersburg could go. Literally the capacity, as former General Dwight D. Eisenhower, remember Normandy, remember the Crusade in Europe, remember victory in Europe, one of the principal military architects of that, and then of course a two-term president. His famed, and we still have that today, acronym MAD, mutual destruction, MAD. And it would be madness. So it ushered in World War II. The nuclear age, FDR wisely said, gave the green light in 1941 when scientists came to him and said, we need to develop, and it's possible, splitting the atom. If we need to develop a nuclear capacity, in other words, a super bomb, the most destructive weapon in history, the most destructive weapon that's imaginable. FDR greenlighted it, spent tens of millions of dollars, ultimately $2 billion, the Manhattan Project, to develop the atomic bomb and an atomic arsenal. And of course, the Soviet Union, all resources went into developing its nuclear capacity. So we ushered in the nuclear age. At the same time, there was another aspect of World War II that certainly we're seeing the effects of today. There was a little thing called colonialism. Britain and France for 2 centuries, in Asia, in Africa, but to a lesser extent, Latin America and the Caribbean. Nations, primarily people of color, Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, were colonies, crown colonies, or not colonies, of Britain and France, to an extent Portugal, but primarily Britain and France. A weakened Britain, on its knees Britain, a weakened France, and on its knees France, had no choice. After a few years kicking and screaming, and the U.S. putting pressure, because the U.S. now is thinking, we're a global player now. We want those markets that will open up, that the British and the French have controlled for millennia. Decolonization came very swiftly. In the late 40s, of course, India and Pakistan, they were among the first in the door. Many other Asian nations, first in the door, and second in the door, and third in the door, declaring independence. In the late 50s, 1960s, all, with one or two exceptions, African nations declaring independence, decolonizing. Within the Caribbean, by the mid-60s, all of the islands, with one or two exceptions, were independent of Britain and France. So once again, World War II opened things up globally. And also, a third thing, China. We're seeing that today now with the huge conflict now between the U.S. and China. Now it's a major player. And we're seeing that with the tariff wars. China was not a major player during World War II. It was a warlord, occupied, corrupt, impoverished nation. A revolution, Mao, the Communist Revolution, 1949, a new China, and then in the next few decades, moving away from Mao and hard-line communism and confrontation, now industry, development, capitalism, investment. Now we have a situation where China now is rising from a backwater, not even considered by FDR and, of course, the Allies, a worthy ally fighting the Japanese during World War II. Now, it has become a global power. Japan, for a couple of decades, right after that, its recovery, and Germany, its recovery, became literally, and have become, and continue to be, major financial, major industrial, major manufacturing, and major exporting countries. In other words, now, even though they were beaten, even though they were vanquished by the war, Germany, Japan emerged. Again, coming out of World War II. And of course, the state of Israel, coming out of the Holocaust, the destruction of 6 million plus Jews. Israel. And we can debate, and there are debates and political debates and ideological debates about Israel and the Palestinians, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about a byproduct of World War II, and World War II, in this case, Israel was one of the results. Independence, United Nations guarantee that, Soviet Union, the U.S., and of course, a mandate becoming not a mandate anymore, but an independent nation in the late 1940s. The global dynamic changed. Relations changed globally. Industry changed globally. Transportation of goods and services across borders changed. Even the European Union and Brexit. Churchill, essentially visionary, thought and saw and envisioned one day a united Europe coming out again of World War II, breaking down the barriers, breaking down the borders, breaking down the boundaries, anything, not only economic and finance, but also always in the back of their mind, no more wars, like we have had twice, World War I, World War II, and the destruction. All right, coming back to the U.S., whether it's civil rights, whether it's minorities, people of color, women, whether it's industry, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's trade, whether it's tariffs, whether it's communications, whether it's technological inventions and developments, computers, internet, television, even orange juice, frozen foods came out of that, canned foods, packaged foods, political changes, every area, political, economic, social, educational life, we can directly attribute to World War II. My book, How World War II Remade America. I walk through, talk through, and essentially assess and analyze all the major changes we saw as a result of the most destructive war in global world history that had profound changes during that period, and more importantly, profound changes that stay with us today. I'm Earl Ofari Hutchinson. My new book, How World War II Remade America, and is still remaking America today.